Martin Luther King said that we shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He advocated against black people being stereotyped and convinced the world to give them a second chance. And so, there was a renaissance of black culture. There was a time when it was an utmost honor for a millennial to be complimented by a black guy, and when sub-Saharan Africans in Europe weren't synonymous with. As you can tell, things quickly went downhill. It is a custom in discussing race relations to blame every shortcoming of the black community on white people, but in this courthouse, we shall judge everyone as equals before Yakub. To help answer the question, why is black fatigue at an all-time high? Well, I'll spare you having to wait for an obvious answer. It's because, unfortunately, many black people seem to have forgotten that to fight stereotypes, you have to not act like them. Disclaimer, I am not trying to justify hate or racism, this is simply an answer to a question. This video isn't about the entire black race. There are well-adjusted black people out there who go for the same fatigue as everyone else. I will be speaking of people of general sub-Saharan descent because, let's be honest, the results are pretty much the same no matter the region. But for now, let's focus on the least serious charges, the oddities, that make you question certain black traits but harbor no resentment. Most oddities are harmless to anyone outside of Africa, and any negative impact they have is only felt by black people themselves. But with the floodgates into the West open, you might want to pay attention. Written colonial accounts of Africa are absolute gems. You see, these texts convey knowledge that has been long forbidden from popular discourse. For example, when someone asks you a question, why is Africa perpetually underdeveloped? The best answer you can get from a peer-reviewed expert meta-study is, well, it's because white people are the literal devil and are responsible for all harm 300 years back and millennia into the future. On the other hand, the explorer will tell you that Africa is dysfunctional because it's inhabited by Africans. Frederick Lugard was one of them. What stuck with me the most is when he wrote that the African loves the display of power, but fails to realize its responsibility. In the 1960s, after a century of colonialism, the European powers started withdrawing from Africa. Year by year, more countries started being ruled by black people. The first president of Ghana said that the most important thing is independence, and that all that is good would emerge from the very fact of independence from colonial powers. Who of the opposing teams was correct? You be the judge.
This film only says farewell to the old Africa and gives to the world the picture of its agony.
As you can see, things didn't really go as planned. This footage comes from a 1964 documentary aptly called Farewell Africa, and it is unfortunately an unscripted course of events. You might get the idea that these guys had no clue what they're doing, and you'd be right. The entirety of Africa essentially said, I don't need no Europe in here, and gave proof that they indeed needed the Europeans. In the Congo, for example, the colonial governments tried to convince the protesting Africans that they cannot give away every public or technical office to blacks because they aren't qualified yet. The mobs didn't listen and got rid of the only people who knew how to maintain infrastructure, and as a result, they exchanged one foreign power for another because 60 years later, someone had to come and fix the effects of black self-rule. And that is perfectly documented in the Empire of Dust, also known as the first ever recorded case of the Chinese getting black fatigue. The documentary follows a Chinese contractor and his African translator who have the simple task of getting gravel from point A to point B to finish constructing a road. In the quarry which is supposed to supply them with gravel, the workers are just standing around doing nothing. The owner of the quarry is late and tries to sell them the wrong kind of gravel at an inflated price, and if it wasn't bad enough already, back at base the truck owners had to start measuring the fuel in centimeters because the Africans kept stealing it. On top of that, black drivers aren't really used to treating their trucks gently, to say the least, so the equipment is often battered. But why are the Chinese even building a road there? Well, that's because the Congolese have not maintained any infrastructure since the colonial authorities left. The Congo actually had more working railways during colonialism than they had in the early 2000s. As they say, what did Zimbabwe use for light before candles? Electricity. I'm not a brain-dead boomer to be into instant karma or fuck around and find out type content, but the history of post-colonial Africa fits into that narrative, unfortunately. Keep in mind that unlike leftists, I am not basing my opinion on works of fiction. The display of hopelessness at every societal level shown in both films actually prompted me to ask the Africa question. What if it isn't just malicious outside forces keeping Africa impoverished, but also the common people as well? It was like the moment in the Truman Show when the stage light fell, a realization that something is up with the supposed doctors and rocket scientists from below the Sahara Desert. What perplexes me is that someone looked at these people and said, you know what Europe needs a lot of? As many of them as we can cram onto our continent. They say only importing infinite sub-Saharans will save the West from economic collapse brought on by low birth rates. But hold on, I think I heard that song before. 300 years back, North American slave owners said that if they weren't allowed to import and breed infinity West Africans in the South, the cash crop economy based on tobacco and cotton is going to collapse. That's because we're dealing with the same historical archetype of evil, the importers, a powerful group of people who, under the guise of a pragmatic economic justification, want to flood their countries with endless foreigners, impoverishing native workers, and making the wealthy even wealthier. It happened once with patricians flooding Rome with war captives during the late Republic. It happened twice with North American slavery, and finally with the current generation of bureaucrats dumping sub-Saharans into the West to save the birth rates. It is like a true Pandora's box that once opened releases loud black women into public spaces. We no longer are dealing with a simple oddity, something that we can observe from a distance. No, this time the subjects are the people who, through the means of willful or forced importation, have found themselves in the West. We're entering the threshold of the inconvenience, where the black antics and shenanigans start to be felt by everyone, not just the black community itself. So why not start with the most notorious type? African Americans are a group whose ancestors got dragged out from the least developed place on the planet to arguably one of the most. The problem is the rural southerners who became the main civilizing force weren't the most civilized to begin with. The evolving African American identity enveloped the worst aspects of white hick culture, such as blood feuds, a lackluster work ethic, pointless bloodshed being seen as masculine, and developed it into an ongoing tragedy also known as modern ghetto culture. But how does this translate into reality? It's interesting how someone is able to turn an already bad situation into a terrible one. Escalating a misdemeanor into a full-blown felony or an even worse result is a hellish perspective. But it seems that black people, just like in other avenues of life, are overrepresented, notably in cases of giving up their life for a one-way ticket to Valhalla. However, it isn't all just about being short-sighted, but also about not knowing when to step back. The restaurant rumble, the drive-thru tussle, or the carnival cruise clash all result from an inability to solve problems without escalation. Being stubborn and incapable of taking an insult without turning the whole venue into a battleground isn't a virtue. If there's one word in the world that describes contemporary black culture best, it definitely isn't polite. A lack of courtesy translates to a disregard of any societal rules that make the West be at all different from Somalia. Fortunately, ghetto culture is here to bridge that gap by the means of the street takeover, cutting up traffic, the devious lick, and the Kia challenge. Why does every trend with black roots or a large black fan base have to revolve around being a nuisance to society? So it should be no surprise that this October marks the first time in 35 years when a rap song hasn't been in the top 40 songs list. People are starting to grow fatigued of the 80 IQ mumbling black man genre of music, but you'd be wrong to think this is just about artistic value. The vernacular, the ways of dressing, and demeanor have overstayed their welcome under the spotlight. But this topic warrants an update to the dichotomy. It's no longer what blacks did to the world, but what rap music did to black people. There was this particular type of person present throughout the West, the moral outrage alarmist, usually an old person who used to haunt the discourse by saying that rock and roll is satanic, that video games cause violence, and that rap makes you murder people. During the era of millennial occupied culture, everyone always hated these individuals for their supposed misunderstanding of it, but as Zoomers, we have to interface with the fact that these people were partially right. rap completely one-shotted blacks because it made the most vile and socially corrosive form of expression the only mainstream aspect of our culture, which we traditionally view as a monument to human achievement, but as we're slowly learning, it isn't always the case. In African American history, there's a notable shift where black culture stopped being just a product of poverty and became the thing that perpetuated it for generations to come. We have been told time and time again that welfare is meant to help integrate people who have been alienated from society. Is this the case? In the UK, only 1 in 10 Somalians are in full-time employment. In the Netherlands, almost €1 million are not just spent on a sub-Saharan, but forever wasted, since the only thing they do is extend the dysfunctional customs of their homelands onto European soil. Rightfully so, Americans might laugh at the uselessness of the European welfare state, but let's see what their social programs have been historically funding. The invention and continued creation of rap music, not the 9-volt battery, talking during movies, and race riots. The original purpose of social programs was to help people affected by unforeseen natural circumstances, but soon it started affirming a culture which hates everything about white society, but still reaps its benefits. It's divine to see people who are a net negative on the budget act like we owe them money. The fate of a medieval peasant whose taxes often consisted of a little more than a tithe to the church seems enviable to a life devoted to slaving away just to have your tax money given to Israel or a member of a perpetual societal underclass. So let's see at least what value we're getting in return. In 2017, 4 Chicago black teens kidnapped an 18-year-old mentally disabled white guy. They tortured him for 2 days, beat him, made him drink toilet water, scalped a part of his head, while constantly shouting racial insults at him. All 4 perpetrators received lenient sentences, with 3 of them serving less than half their time before being released. As they say, mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent. But this is emblematic of a greater issue on American soil. Looking at the graph of black incarceration rates, you might notice that they started dropping around the year 2000. You might even think that this is because they stopped committing so much crime, and technically, you'd be right, because many acts that were previously deemed criminal activities, such as drug possession, petty theft, and looting, were methodically decriminalized and ignored. Many police departments have simply stopped reporting crime data, with many more submitting only partial statistics. The classic FBI crime reports are no longer accurate for more than one reason. It is truly over. The great American noticer and poet Ezra Pound once said that America is a lunatic asylum, but it's more like an open-air prison, where the general public gets to experience the consequences of not only leniency, but also an affirmation and encouragement of a dysfunctional ghetto culture. We're entering the realm of the image, also known as evidence that speaks for itself. At this level, fatigue is not only developed, but it is synthesized in a complex chemical reaction to create the first ever instances of white rage. These events usually become instantly buried by the media, but what is dangerous is they linger on in the memory of many. But let's not jump the queue so early. The civil rights era produced some of the most distinct moments of the 20th century. The whole movement is built on a series of images and symbols that have paved the way for its resounding success and far-reaching implications. But just how the movement was built on pictures and images, those snapshots of reality will eventually be its undoing. For a movement called civil rights, they got off to an ironic start. In 1957, federal troops were sent to Little Rock, Arkansas, to ensure desegregation was being respected in a local high school, resulting in the parents being marched at gunpoint and their children being forced to integrate. Of course, there's nothing wrong with equal access to schools, but this spoils the contemporary perception of civil rights as a grassroots movement. You might have seen this picture before. This is the statue of General Robert E. Lee being melted down by Black Lives Matter activists. Before you call me a hypocrite for defending the slave-owning side now, realize that the end result of turning this monument into slag is the erasure of white history, only to get replaced by a fat black woman in the about to chimp out at Walmart pose. What kind of hell are we living through? This event is pretty much forgotten by now, but these ones you will never fail to miss. Black people tend to be like ectothermic organisms. Almost every large-scale ghetto riot has taken place between April and August, and even then they usually happen at times of extreme heat. They usually take place under the guise of getting justice for a case of alleged police brutality, and for the longest time people went along with this excuse. But all of this changed because of one invention. Body cams were implemented to be a means of curbing police brutality, and instead they've single-handedly exposed how bad black people are at remaining stationary. Most media coverage of black violence is caked in euphemisms: playmate, teen, Florida boyfriend. But the raw footage of the body cam helps to convey the spirit a little bit more accurately. Same thing goes for mugshots. No amount of omissions will soften the blow that a guy that looks like this just stabbed 3 children to death. And here's a lesson to remember: when you're trying to seem like a peaceful movement fighting for justice, make sure the cameras aren't rolling when you're being a menace to society.
Looks like people are looting anything they can get their hands on. Here's a guy with a plant, even. I'm a news reporter. Oh, God! No! Rocks and bottles being thrown at another car. They're kicking the driver and beating the driver. All this guy did was enter this area. That's his only crime.
The '92 LA riots were the first televised chimp-out event. They cemented the black fight for justice against police brutality as a movement that above everything hates more successful people going about their daily lives. I like the looting, burning and attacking random businesses, followed by being surprised why nobody wants to live next to them. Good thing they did it twice. Just so their cause, even if actually justified in some cases, gets remembered as a chaotic act of lashing out against any signs of civilization. The riots have been a PR disaster for the black community, but it is far from the most damaging blow to their perception in the public eye. The surveillance state has an interesting side effect. It makes previously abstract concepts materialize into tangible occurrences. Such is the case with interracial crime, which even on paper is a bit one-sided to say the least. Blacks justify this by saying they're victims of a white system. In just 6 years, they killed as many whites as the total number of black people lynched in close to a century. There are crazy individuals of every race. But by the means of a disproportionate amount of anti-white violence, they're making it so the only way to avoid a situation like this is to be prejudiced. But alas, we've seen the images that build civil rights, and now you're aware of the pictures that have given birth to black fatigue. But there's one more image I've skipped over, because just like the N-word, it's been made a taboo. In 1969, a researcher at UC Berkeley named Arthur Jensen wrote a scientific paper on the topic of race and IQ. His article was soon removed from the journal so he couldn't respond to criticism. The students burned effigies of him, sent him death threats and got him fired from the university. But what did he say to get himself cancelled by the ever-enlightened scientific community? He claimed that the IQ gap between blacks and whites is genetic. In mainstream science, there exist 2 explanations for the IQ gap. The first one is the Reddit-approved, wholesome socioeconomic explanation, claiming that this behavioral and cognitive gap is caused by poverty and unequal opportunities, meaning that if we fix said issues, the gap will disappear. On the other hand, the genetic explanation states that the relation between IQ and poverty is more complex than meets the eye. This view is extremely problematic, because in its most extreme interpretation, the rate at which the IQ gap can be closed will never exceed the rate at which humans undergo evolution. Of course, I do not endorse the genetic explanation, but someone will have to play devil's advocate. In one corner we have the Southern poverty laws and our #1 public enemies, and in the opposite we have the early life crew who get to start first because I don't want to be labeled an anti-Semite. They say that family income, education quality, and grotesque nutritional practices impact intelligence development and behavior. This is an obvious truth both sides can agree on, but wait a moment. How is it that when you're doing violent crime, you're statistically more likely to be black than from a high unemployment or impoverished area? You see, race forms a stronger correlation with violent crime than socioeconomic status. Another interesting thing is how the poorest white households still perform similarly to the richest blacks in school examinations. Why is that? The early life crew would say that the factor causing these discrepancies is black people having worse access to good quality education, which is actually a fact. So let's see what happens when the opposite is true. In 1985, in Missouri, a federal plan was enacted to boost the performance of disadvantaged black kids by providing them with state-of-the-art school facilities. Up to $11,000 were spent per student. There was one teacher per 12 students, one of the best ratios in the whole country. 15 new schools were built, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a robotics lab, and a 25-acre wildlife sanctuary were constructed to help close the test score gap between blacks and whites. The results? Test scores did not grow and there was less integration than before. In turn, the r/anthropology corner responds with the nuclear option. Disproving the socioeconomic explanation doesn't automatically make the genetic explanation true. There are very few reputable studies that are willing to make the connection between IQ and race. Keyword: are willing to. In most Western countries, there are laws and organizations in place to halt any research into race and IQ. Ethics committees make it impossible to conduct, let alone publish any study, because they're exclusively staffed by the type of women who gesticulate too much when talking. But when something becomes a taboo, it starts drawing people in and leaves them asking the question, what are they hiding? These alleles are associated with intelligence, and they are found most often in East Asians and whites, while being less abundant in Sub-Saharan Africans. But this evidence, it doesn't say much, since these alleles could be not hereditary and just markers of intelligence instead of causes. A more notable difference is cortical thickness, which is the thickness of the outer layer of the brain, and directly correlates with intellectual ability, and if too thin is responsible for ADHD and lower IQ. Not only is it mostly heritable, meaning that it is determined largely by genes, but it is also seen to be generally thicker in Eurasian subjects and less so in African ones. This might be responsible for some of the IQ gap, but we will never know unless scientists are actually allowed to study this field. End results? I can't say, for two very different but equally important reasons. At the end of the day, there are two takeaways from this video. Redditors who heckin' love science by censoring racial discourse have only made it more alluring, and more importantly, the ability to take photos and record videos becoming available to everyone, not just journalists, has completely derailed 60 years of civil rights.